We are honored today to be speaking with Kyle Strobel. Kyle Strobel is Associate Professor of Spiritual Theology at Talbot School of Theology. Dr. Strobel, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much.
We are really glad to have you with us. And on the side, how did you feel about your film performance as a small child in the recent King for Christ film?
I can tell you this, nothing could have prepared me for the weirdness of sitting in a movie theater watching myself be born.
I tell you, that is incredible. Dr. Strobel, it is indeed an honor to be speaking with you, and we're delighted today to be speaking the book that you wrote with Oliver Crisp, Jonathan Edwards, An Introduction to His Thought, produced by Oliver Crisp and Kyle Strobel. Dr. Strobel, let's just jump straight into it, if we may.
Sure.
Jonathan Edwards is said to be not only one of the greatest theologians to be born and bred on American soil, but also one of the greatest philosophers. In your view, what aspect of Jonathan Edwards' legacy best showcases this extraordinary genius?
Yeah, well, Edwards, it's funny, the way he's been received. I think a lot of that, particularly on the philosophical side, if you look at the secondary literature and the legacy in Edwards' studies, we have such a massive amount of work done on Edwards today, and it all stems from Perry Miller, an atheist, who basically is looking at Edwards thinking, man, if only this guy would have been a poet instead of a pastor. And he sees his theology as a detriment to his genius. And so I think in a lot of ways, Edwards is one of the great minds. But what's funny about that, and I don't think we could doubt that. I mean, I think he is genuinely one of the, top 10 minds in church history. But his corpus isn't written that way, right? It's not like he's just writing these highly sophisticated intellectual works all the time. Like, he's mostly preaching. One of his most famous works that have never been out of print to this day is The Life of David Brainerd. And it's like, this is, Edwards, as a pastor theologian, had a real orientation towards these developments on the ground of caring for his people. And so while he could turn into a purely philosophical mode, I mean, you think of a work like True Virtue, or in some of his work on original sin, you get this highly philosophical and many times peculiar sort of philosophy of the Enlightenment. He shows his intellect, and he really is working in a conversation that is European. You think of this post-Locke kind of discussion of folks like Malebranche, like Barclay, and Edwards is doing that kind of work. But I kind of think it is a little bit on the side of his thinking. I mean, we're getting a lot of it from his notebooks. He's not publishing the bulk of it. I mean, this Edwards, I think, as a person, was much more captivated by the theological ideas, and what drove him into the philosophical discussions was that he lives in a world, particularly an intellectual world, that couldn't kind of contain the Christian, particularly the Reformed view of reality. And so suddenly he's presented a world, and he has to figure out, how do I maintain a distinctively kind of Reformed view when we have this kind of mechanistic causation now, when we have this post-Newton kind of idea that this world is this series of kind of gears almost. And it's like, well, what is left for God to do? And so Edwards is constantly turning to these philosophical notions in order to say what he wants to say theologically. And so I tend to look at Edwards as a theologian first and foremost, who had a kind of wildly impressive philosophical mind. And yet I think the legacy that sees him primarily as a philosopher is more of a secular one that wants to see him in the vein of kind of a theoretical version of Ben Franklin or something, this kind of, great mind on the wilderness front. Whereas I see Edwards much more as this churchman who is trying to wield his intellect for the glory of God in whatever comes up and it comes his way, whether that's the revivals, whether that's Brainerd dying on his couch, whether, it's original sin being kind of undermined by these great texts that he takes on. I mean, it's Edwards trying to be faithful in whatever the Lord's kind of brought his way in a very theological vein that takes on this very philosophical structure to it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strobel. Dr. Strobel, if I'm hearing you rightly, I'm hearing that Jonathan Edwards, with his voracious mind, is putting things together that that create a friction or create a problem for his reformed theological positions, and he's reaching out to philosophical resources in order to massage those back into order or to create continuity again. If I'm hearing you rightly on that, what are some of the impetuses for these problems, these theological problems that force him to reach to philosophical resources?
Well, I think, I think Edwards would have seen his own theological views as right in line with Reformed thought. And I think he's basically trying to just further that. The problem now, unlike, a couple hundred years before, is we have a view, particularly of cosmology, that inhibits the thinking about how do we understand the God-world relation, and then how does that affect how we come to understand these things. So let me just give you an example. A lot of evangelicals may look at someone like Edwards as having a standard Reformed view of freedom. And I think that's just false. I think Edwards has a very radical view of freedom. By and large, I don't think the Reformed have ever struggled with freedom until you get to around Edwards. And now, and the way I read Edwards is, because many people just assume Edwards is a determinist. And in one sense, that's true. He has a very deterministic framework. But I think what's a more accurate way of putting that is Edwards is handed determinism. Edwards is handed a structure of reality that is deterministic. And when he writes on freedom, he's trying to carve out space for creaturely freedom in a deterministic framework. Well, that's a different way. That leads him to kind of changing the discussion a bit about freedom and what freedom was and how to think about it. It changes definitions of things a little bit. But when you're handed this kind of either or, like either God must do nothing, and therefore you get like a deist kind of frame, and that was on the rise in his day, or God does everything, Edwards is going to have God do everything. But then he's going to try to figure out, how do I say what the Reformed have always wanted to say, even if God is doing everything? Like, how do I make sense of that? And we'll talk about this a bit more, no doubt, but I have a way to think about this where I say, well, I think Edwards' instinct is right, but there was just actually better resources in the tradition to do so than he had to deal with. But I kind of think, I think to read Edwards charitably, we have to kind of understand how new a lot of these ideas are. I mean, he's on the forefront of an entire wave of Enlightenment ideas, and he is kind of spinning his wheels immediately trying to make sense of reality in light of this new frame of understanding the world. And it leads him into some problems. There's no doubt about that. But I think if you attend to his theological instincts, I think his theological instincts actually point to a way beyond them that, unfortunately, the philosophy that he was kind of forced to turn to make sense of them ended up stifling him more than helping him at times, I think.
Dr. Strobel, I'm very grateful for that response. We're working through Jonathan Edwards, An Introduction to His Thought by Oliver Crisp and Kyle Strobel. Thanks again for joining us today. Dr. Strobel, Jonathan Edwards worked for the extent of his professional life as a village pastor, not as an academic theologian or a philosopher. For whom was Edwards writing when he develops these technical, philosophical, or at least philosophically inclined theological treatises?
Well, Edwards very much, one of the things I think we have to remember about Edwards is he wasn't American, right? He was technically British. This is before there's America, right? And so he sees himself as in a sense a European, right? He sees himself as a part of this British and European conversation, and he wants to be seen that way. And so, when a book gets written against original sin, all these people start saying no one can defeat this book. That's like a guarantee Edwards is going to write against it. Like, Edwards understood him. He kind of recognized his place. He kind of knew he at least, particularly in the colonies, he's one of the great minds, and he's got to defend orthodoxy, right? And so he's going to give an account of justification by faith. He's going to give an account of original sin. He's going to take on these various kind of hot button questions of the day, because in Edwards' own mind, like, if he doesn't do it, who's going to, right? Who's going to pick up the mantle? And it was very clear, even in his own lifetime, that he was a radical mind. He really was profound. And yet, it's funny, and I think we sometimes neglect, one of my favorite works of Edwards is Charity and Its Fruits, right? It's biblical meditation on love. or that he takes time to do the life of David Brainerd, or that he writes, and probably is best known, other than the Sinner's Sermon, probably best known for religious affections. Like, here's a book that is an attempt to discern what does it mean to discern the work of the Spirit? Like, how do we understand that? And some of the things that these all have in common is that Edwards was kind of at heart a polemicist. And so, again, I think some of the philosophical kind of instinct in his acumen is driven by his desire to enter into these polemics and to fight for orthodoxy. And there really were battles on every front. I mean, I think you have all of the post-Reformation heresies. After the Reformation, you have all the old heresies come back that are driven by biblicism. And so you have the Socinians, you have these Neo-Arians, you have these anti-Trinitarians of all stripes. Plus, you have these groups like the Quakers, like these mystical groups, even some we don't know about anymore, like the Family of Love, often called the Familiists, and these groups that are doing this really radical mystical stuff. You even have in the colonies some of the holdover from the century before with like Anne Hutchinson and these things. So there's all these heresies everywhere you look. And then there's, even within the broader orthodoxy, you have a group of people that are kind of highly intellectual, kind of rejecting the revivals, and Edwards is even against them. So everywhere he turned, there were certain kind of polemical partners he's engaging. And I think Edwards' approach was, I'm going to write something so profound that I'm just going to bowl you over with the sheer kind of intellectual rigor of this thing. And that's often kind of what he ended up doing.
Dr. Strobel, your study begins with an outline of Edwards' theology on the Trinity. What is it, precisely, if you would, that is new in Edwards' presentation of the doctrine of the Trinity?
Yeah, on first glance, it appears Augustinian, right? Like in a very broad way. I mean, even using that term, that's debatable what that means. But by that I mean he's using a psychological analogy, God as a mind that has understanding and will. Edwards ends up radicalizing Augustine. Augustine explicitly says, now what I don't mean is that for the Father to kind of intellect, now you have the Son, and the Son kind of is the Father's, and that is exactly what Edwards does say. The Holy Spirit just is the will of God. And so on Edwards' account, you have this kind of understanding of the persons as attributes of God, of the divine life, understanding and will respectively. And what only makes them persons is that they're interpenetrating one another. And so here's what I think is interesting about that. Like traditionally, at least, this is a little bit kind of superficial, but often how this gets taught, right, is that, well, you're always kind of leaning towards one thing, like leaning a little too much towards threeness, and you're getting closer to tritheism, or you're pushing a little too hard at oneness, and maybe we don't get a robust enough threeness. The way Edwards runs the discussion is it's obviously really focused on the kind of unity, this singularity of God, so much so that at first glance, you don't even have three persons yet. But then by focusing so much on their personhood through their interpenetration, Edwards uses social language quite readily, and he can talk about the threeness really robustly, because to kind of push on threeness only makes the unity tighter. Another way of looking at it would be, one of the great axioms of the early church is going to be the external action of God is undivided, right? So we might see God in history as the Son. That isn't to say the Son is somehow working apart from Father and Spirit, right? Like these are undivided actions. Edwards kind of reads that back up into the inner life of God, so much so that the personhood of the three are undivided in that regard. So you can't ever get towards three individuals. And what's so profound about this, and the reason I think Edwards is doing it in part, is again, you get all this anti-Trinitarianism going on. And Edwards starts his work on the Trinity, called the Discourse on the Trinity, with basically a singular God who's a person with understanding and will. And so every anti-Trinitarian, and they're all biblicists, they're all reading the Bible saying, okay, we agree this. He then starts reading Scripture and saying, isn't it interesting that God's understanding shows up in history? And we have, the Word became flesh. Well, that's interesting. Well, what is the Word other than an inner understanding? And he begins doing all this biblical work to talk about well, wait a second, how is it meaningful to say that these attributes, so to speak, are actually entering creation as persons? And then on the tail end of his work on the Trinity, he's going to give an account of, well, how do we make sense of that? And so he kind of brings the anti-Trinitarians along with him, saying, well, okay, God's a single person, sure, but now the Bible reads this way. these seem to be persons. How do we actually speak meaningfully about that? And so that ends up being how he develops it. And there's several things about that are unique. I mean, he really focuses pretty heavily on the blessedness of God. God is infinitely happy in himself. He is, as I would put it, he is infinite religious affection, that God is affection overflowing infinitely in himself. And one of the things that is somewhat peculiar is God's life, the way Edwards understands the Son proceeding and the Spirit proceeding, is through the lens of the Beatific Vision. And so God just is having the Beatific Vision with himself. And the Beatific Vision is the traditional Christian way of thinking about, the end of the believer being to see God face to face. But now God's own inner life is the Father gazing upon the Son gazing upon the Father, and love pouring forth between them. And I think Edwards would say, and of course this is just image to us in Jesus' baptism, when the heavens are opened, the Father gazes upon the Son, and the belovedness of the Spirit pours forth down upon him. That's an image of what's going on internal to God's life. And those things none of those things are totally unique, but he kind of pulls them together in a pretty unique package. And the way he understands that kind of personhood idea, it seems to Oliver and I is like, there is something that we can generally call kind of an Edwardsian model of the Trinity that I don't know if anyone else has quite done this before.
Dr. Strobel, if I can ask you, in chapter 3, which is titled God and Idealism, you discuss Edwards' conclusion that, quote, all existing things are ideal. And what this means is that all that exists as an idea and not as a material reality. And this is not a lone instance of a philosophically driven notion in Edwards' thought that seems really foreign to myself and other modern readers, perhaps.
Yeah.
What do you do when you come across and are trying to make use of Edwards today when you find one of these perhaps obtuse philosophical inclinations?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately on a lot of these, like Edwards would actually say, like he to himself in notebooks, like I can speak to the average person who still believes in matter, just like we all believe in the same sort of thing. So for him, it didn't make a radical difference in terms of, like, he didn't always have to lead. Now remember, I'm an idealist, therefore that's going to change all of this. He's also an atomist, which is peculiar. And so he believes in atoms, but basically at bottom, atoms don't have solidity. There's God's immediate presence that upholds them. And so for Edwards, idealism's interesting. Once you recognize that matter isn't chunks of stuff, so to speak, very plainly, right? Some of the chunks of stuff that kind of makes things. Then the question becomes, well, what's underneath that materiality? Well, it turns out to be a bunch of things that don't look like matter anymore. And so I actually think in the next 20 years, we're going to see the rise of idealism. Actually, we're already seeing the rise of idealism. I think someone like Stephen Hawking was an idealist, for instance, although I don't think he quite knew the term. There's actually been a major 2-volume study on idealism just published, with Barclay being the philosophical kind of genius and Edwards actually being the theological genius behind it. And so there's actually being a recovery of this view. I kind of look at it as the right mistake to make. I think it's a mistake. It's obviously well, maybe not obviously. It's, in my mind, a much better view than materialism, which we tend to assume. Although, again, the materialism we tend to assume tends to be very non-material. And I don't know if we spend a lot of time really thinking about what materialism entails. In light of what we think matter now is that actually materialism? Like, how do we make sense of what we're talking about when we talk about something like matter? And so for Edwards, he's looking at the world and he's saying, idealism doesn't make this stuff less substantial. It's just that all of this is resting on ideas, and ultimately what's upholding it are ideas, and that therefore this is all kind of partaking in God's knowing of it. That what makes something real is that God knows it as such. And so I think as we were talking earlier about, Edwards, again, he's got this worldview that's been handed to him where it's very mechanistic. Forces are back in play, and you have gravity, and all these things are held together, all these kind of ways of seeing reality that seem to push God outside of it. Edwards is relocating God in the midst of it in his idealism. And I think if you look at it that way, most of Edwards' radical philosophy makes sense, where Edwards is trying to make a case for God's action in creation, while assuming the kind of newer worldview for him that creation is this kind of mechanistic reality. And so how do we make sense of God's action in that kind of reality? Well, you make God the gears. You actually make God the undergirding of this sort of thing. And so I think that he was trying to make sense of a reality that is still substantial while also having God as the kind of fundamental bedrock of the whole thing.
Dr. Strobel, if I can fast forward just a little bit in your book to chapter 6. Chapter 6 is titled Salvation as Participation. You write that Edwards advances a Reformed doctrine of theosis. Mm-hmm. First of all, would you be willing to define for us and our viewers what is theosis? And then
Sure.
Secondarily, isn't that contrary to a Reformed view of the world?
Yeah, so theosis, this is a bit of a stickier conversation. So theosis is in my mind, now this is, keep remembering that in my mind, so this is my view. Theosis is the Christian view of salvation. I actually don't think there is another. There's a lot of confusion about it today. Sometimes you'll see like five views books on justification with theosis as one of them, but theosis isn't a view of justification. So that is a category fallacy. Basically, if you go back to Athanasius is going to say things like, God became man so that man can become God. And they called that theosis. Now that sounds really bad to us, and they had all sorts of worries about it as well. And what you see coming out of the patristic era are two distinct strands of that tradition. One strand really focused on the creature, the Christian, kind of gaining attributes of God like incorruptibility and other sorts of attributes, all the while never becoming God, right? So we never partook of the divine essence. The way this develops among the Eastern Orthodox is they develop much later a view of the divine energy. So they say, well, we partake in the divine energies, that's not becoming God. But it is, and most of these discussions are predicated on a reading of 2 Peter 1:4, we are partakers of the divine nature. Right, so they're trying to make sense of that. There's another line, and this is the line that the Protestants, whether Wesleyan, Lutheran, or Reformed, always followed on this, is that theosis was a sharing among the relations of the divine persons. So it was a much more relational notion. And even in the patristic era, theosis was seen as synonymous with adoption. And so we are adopted in the life of God in the Son, and therefore we share in the Son's life with the Father. And so this gets developed, and even Calvin, Calvin in his commentary on 2 Peter gets to 2 Peter 1:4 and says, this is deification, which is just another synonym of theosis. What's happened for us, I think one of the problems we see currently, particularly among kind of Protestant academics, is, and my friend Carl Moser's done really great work on this, showing that actually in the 20th century, everyone had forgotten about theosis. Eastern Orthodox, Catholics, Protestants, no one talked about it. It was recovered by a group of Russian Eastern Orthodox theologians, and people just began to assume it was an Eastern Orthodox doctrine. And then it became like, oh, the East is into this sort of thing, whereas the West, we do something different. Well, that it turns out historically that's just not true. That there is at the broadest level of salvation a kind of meta-narrative of sharing in God's life. And I would say this is exactly what Paul does in Ephesians 2-4, which is why when in Ephesians 4, Paul's saying kind of what the Gentiles have missed out on because they are darkened in their understanding is they do not get to share in God's life. Right? That's what they've missed out on. And so this takes a distinctively relational strand that comes from folks like Athanasius and Cyril, these very ancient, very obviously ecumenically oriented patristic theologians, and yet it is taken a distinct direction by the West. And so it doesn't compete with justification. They kind of function, they trade in different kind of registers. You can have a view of justification fully on board with a view of theosis. But that's going to get developed in unique ways in each of these strands. And so you often see edited volumes come out nowadays on like the different views of theosis, and you'll see a Baptist view in there, you'll see a Calvin's view, you'll see Edwards. So there's a recognition now there's all these different strands of things, and everyone wants to be very careful not to say we are ever becoming God. But what the Reformed tend to do from Calvin on is when they read 2 Peter 1:4 and see that we are partakers of the divine nature, that nature is kind of characterological and relational, right? It is sharing in the divine persons. And this is why, even though some Protestants have tried to use the Eastern language of energies, I'm really worried about that, because at least the Eastern theologians are clear. The energies aren't kind of entering creation through the Son and Spirit. So suddenly it's like, well, there's this other economy of God that I worry about. Whereas what Edwards would say, no, to partake in God's life is to be adopted into the life of the Son by the Spirit. And it's to become, I think of Jesus' high priestly prayer, and he ends in John 17:26 by praying, Father, give them the love that you loved me. He doesn't pray, Father, love them, but love them with that same love that you loved me, that God is internalizing us in that love of the Father upon the Son. I'd say that is theosis, at least in this tradition. And what's interesting, in Edwards' own day, when he wrote Religious Affections, he had to qualify, because these more intellectual kind of people who were against, and by intellectual I mean more kind of not interested in the affections, just the intellect, they were attacking the revivals, folks like Charles Chauncey, and he would try to link Edwards with the mystical, kind of radical mystical groups from the century before, who would say things like, we are godded with God and Christed with Christ. And so Edwards picks that language up in the Religious Affections and say, no, we are not godded with God, we are not Christed with Christ. But he does that to try to give an account of, we are partakers of God's life. We are participating in that life of the Father gazing upon the Son and the Son gazing upon the Father, because we have been internalized in the Son. We have union with Christ.
Dr. Strobel, thank you so much for those reflections. And if I can ask a concluding question that we've asked all of the guests that we've had on this program, how is it that we recognize Christian unity, and how is it that we as individual Christians can pursue the unity for which Jesus prayed in John 17?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, there is going to have to be a really honest self-understanding, a really honest attempt to humbly and patiently sit with the text of Scripture, to sit with the voices of the church throughout the tradition, and to listen very well to one another. I mean, I think, even as Edwards as a model for this, Edwards actually saw quite a lot of divisiveness. But Edwards, when he responds to these people that are attacking him, he's very careful to listen to what are they saying actually, and how can I clarify, look, I'm not doing that. Like, I know you think I'm doing that. And, just on a personal note, I teach spiritual theology. I'm a part of a conversation known as the Spiritual Formation conversation, although that's a very broad sort of thing these days. And I've been attacked pretty brutally, to a degree that I wasn't prepared for, quite honestly. And I've never been attacked for something I've said or a belief I hold. And when I'm attacked, it's never been because they've actually listened to my view. And so then I've had to wrestle with, well, my instinct is to attack. But now that's not the call, though, is it? I've got to figure out a way to kind of, do what they need. And this is, for my mind, what funds this for me is the weaker brother discussion in 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians through 10, right? Like, if I'm right and this person's wrong, which I'm assuming is true, right? How do I care for them as the weaker brother or weaker sister? Like, if they're attacking me because they don't like the source I'm using, well, then what sources do they want me to use? I'll read those. If they, how can I help to kind of create a conversation where we're actually patiently listening to one another, and where we're creating a context of pushing into one another in charity, where that doesn't mean we're kind of glossing over difference, but we're speaking really decisively and well in a way that we truly can love one another and therefore exude what Christ said we should, which is that we love one another.
It's been our delight today to be speaking with Dr. Kyle Strobel, Associate Professor of Spiritual Theology at Talbot School of Theology and also co-author of the text we've been discussing today, Jonathan Edwards, An Introduction to His Thought. Thank you so much, Dr. Strobel, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. So good to be here.